Imagine a secret so raw and unsettling that even whispering it in daylight feels dangerous. Imagine a house deep in the Appalachian, in woods where silence is heavier than stone, where voices are replaced by grunts and gestures, and where the shadows of bloodlines twisted upon themselves stretch across generations. The Whittaker family exists in this hidden corner of West Virginia, and their story is not just about isolation, but about a legacy that challenges the very definition of humanity. The town is called Odd, and that name carries a cruel kind of poetry. For decades, the Whittaker home has stood as a weathered monument to secrecy, a place where poverty, decay, and neglect were allowed to ferment until they produced something that feels less like life and more like a forgotten ritual. When filmmaker Mark Laita first walked onto their property, his camera did not just capture people, it captured the collapse of time itself. His lens revealed movements that felt detached from the world, a brother circling the yard, barking instead of speaking, a sister rocking endlessly, as if caught in a rhythm older than memory. The first 8 seconds of seeing them are enough to shake a man. The mind tells you to look away, but something deeper forces you to keep watching. The Whitakers are not monsters. Yet society has painted them as such. They are reflections mirrors, showing us what happens when entire communities decide to close their eyes to suffering. To understand them is to peel back the mask of America itself, revealing truths about neglect, poverty, and the silent cruelty of indifference. What unsettles most observers is not simply their condition, but the silence that surrounds it. Why did no one step in? Why was an entire bloodline left to spiral inward for generations? The answer is more dangerous than you think. It is because people would rather bury discomfort than face it directly. The Whitakers are now not only a family, they are a symbol, a warning, and perhaps even a prophecy. The deeper you descend into their world, the more you begin to feel a chill that is not just about them, but about us all, because if a family can be forgotten, this completely, what else has been hidden in plain sight? What else has society chosen to turn away from while pretending everything is under control? Step closer to the Whittaker home, and you will feel the air itself grow heavy, as though the land is guarding a secret that outsiders were never meant to know. The porch is sagging, the chairs broken, the windows covered with scraps of cloth that once pretended to be curtains. The silence here is not simple, quiet. It is a presence almost alive, pressing against your chest, making each breath feel like an intrusion. Into this silence, Mark Laita carried his camera, and what he found was not only shocking, but deeply symbolic of what happens when a lineage is abandoned. Inside the house, shadows moved across walls darkened with decades of neglect. A man appeared in the doorway. His gaze fixed his body, swaying with uncertain rhythm. His eyes carried a blankness that no words could reach. Behind him came the sounds that defined their language. Low grunts, sharp barks, guttural cries. It was communication stripped down to instinct, yet within it there was order, there was meaning known only to them. The outside world heard chaos, but for the Whitakers it was connection. A boy circled the yard barefoot, the dirt tracing his path into endless loops. Each time he let out a bark, another family member responded, not with words but with echoes, grunts, hums, or silence. It was as if their very reality had drifted into a place just out of reach of ordinary human experience. To outsiders, this behavior felt alien. But the truth is that it was born from generations of isolation and bloodlines folding back upon themselves. What disturbed Mark most was not the strangeness, but the absence of intervention. For decades, neighbors passed by whispering legends, daring children to approach the property while doing nothing to stop the cycle. Some said it was fear, others said shame. But the truth is simpler. It was easier to look away. It was easier to let the Whitakers carry the burden of a cursed bloodline than to confront the fact that their existence was a product of collective neglect, and so the house stood in silence, a shrine to secrets that no one wanted to claim. Every sound, every gesture, every vacant stare was a message carved into the bones of Appalachia. The Whitakers were not merely a family living in isolation. They were a warning, a mirror showing what happens when human beings are left to rot on the edge of society, with no hand extended, no voice calling them back into the world. The further you trace the Whitaker family line, the more you discover that their story is not just about one household, but about generations of decisions that chained them to a destiny they never chose. In the hills of Appalachia, where poverty carves out entire lifetimes, the Whitakers became a legend, not through wealth or power, but through whispers of what they had become. The community called them cursed. But the curse was not supernatural. It was the result of bloodlines twisting inward until identity itself began to blur. When outsiders first heard about them, they imagined monsters, grotesque figures hidden away from the light of the world. But when the truth was revealed, it was far more unsettling. These were human beings, shaped by isolation, denied the chance to grow into anything beyond the boundaries of their family tree. Their faces carried the marks of generations folded back upon themselves, their movements sometimes unpredictable, their words often lost. Yet behind every gesture there was something even harder to look at: innocence. Mark Leiter stood in that yard and realized that every photograph he took was a fragment of American history that most people wanted erased. Society thrives on stories of triumph, resilience, progress. But what happens when you find a story that embodies the opposite? Decay, silence, abandonment. That was the weight of the Whitakers. They were not villains. They were the product of a system that forgot them. In the small town nearby, people spoke of the Whitakers with both pity and ridicule. Some would say, "Do not go near that house." Others would laugh nervously when the name came up, as if the very mention carried bad luck. Yet not a single person tried to reach inside their world, to pull them out. To acknowledge the Whitakers was to acknowledge a failure that stretched far beyond one family. It was to admit that America itself had places so neglected, so forsaken, that people were left to live like this. The real darkness in the Whitaker story is not only the tangled family tree, but the silence of everyone who knew and did nothing. The walls of their house may have been crumbling, the windows clouded with grime, but the true ruin was invisible. It was the ruin of empathy, the erosion of responsibility. The Whitakers became a legend because no one was willing to let them remain simply human. When Mark Leiter stepped onto the Whitaker property for the first time, he was met with stares that were not hostile, but heavy like a weight pressing down from years of being watched, yet never understood. The yard was cluttered with rusted cars and broken furniture, silent witnesses to a family left outside of time. The house itself was less a home and more a cage of survival, where every corner carried the echo of secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. Timmy was the first to catch his attention. A man whose mind seemed caught between two worlds. He could not communicate the way others did. His words came out broken, tangled, more like sounds than sentences, yet his eyes told stories words could never capture. Stories of confusion, of longing, and of a silent plea to be seen for who he was, not just what people assumed. Betty moved carefully around the house, like a guardian, a matriarch who had carried far more than her share of suffering. She spoke little, but her presence filled every space. She was not just a mother or sister, she was the protector of a fragile dynasty bound by blood. Every photograph Mark captured felt like trespassing into a place most would never dare enter. He framed their faces, not to exploit, but to reveal. A viewer might feel unease looking at them, but it was not because the Whitakers were monsters. It was because they forced you to confront something society spends its entire existence running from. The truth that humans are not always shaped by choice but by circumstance. Isolation and bloodline had crafted them into something rare, tragic, and undeniably real. When outsiders later saw these images, they gasped. Some turned away. Some claimed it was cruel to expose the Whitakers to the world. Others leaned closer, unable to look away from the mystery etched into every expression. For Mark, however, it was never about cruelty. It was about honesty. The Whitakers had lived in these shadows too long. He believed they deserved at least to be seen, to be acknowledged as part of the same world that had abandoned them. This encounter marked the beginning of something larger than photographs. It became a confrontation between two realities, the polished face of modern America and the raw truth of what had been hidden in its forgotten corners. The Whitakers were no longer invisible, and that changed everything. Once the Whitaker family photographs reached the outside world, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People who had never set foot in Appalachia suddenly felt they knew its darkest secret. The images spread across forums, social media, and news outlets like wildfire. The world was no longer whispering about the Whitakers. It was staring directly into their eyes, and the reactions revealed as much about society as they did about the family. Some viewers saw tragedy. They spoke about poverty, about genetic entrapment, about how generations could be swallowed by isolation and neglect. Others were cruel, mocking the Whitakers, reducing them to caricatures, forgetting that every face in those photographs belonged to someone who still breathed, still felt, still carried a story. Within the safety of screens, the world picked apart the family, without ever asking what it meant to live their reality. But fascination is a dangerous thing. What began as shock quickly turned into myth. The Whitakers were no longer just people. They were symbols used to represent everything haunting and broken about Appalachia. Rumors grew. People claimed curses. Old rituals or sinister secrets were tied to their bloodline. Fiction layered itself over fact until the truth was harder to find than ever. And the Whitakers themselves remained silent, unable or unwilling to correct what was being said about them. For Mark Leiter, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. He had opened a door, and now the whole world had stepped through. He wrestled with the question: was showing the Whitakers an act of cruelty, or was it an act of humanity? Was exposing their existence to millions of strangers exploitation, or was it finally giving them a voice? The truth lived in a gray space where both answers seemed to exist at once. The internet had turned a forgotten family into a global fascination, but in the frenzy of clicks, views, and gossip, one thing remained lost. The Whitakers were still living in the same decaying home, still surviving day to day in silence. Their lives had not magically improved. Their struggles had not disappeared. The world may have discovered them, but discovery is not the same as salvation. As the story of the Whitakers spread further, they became more than a family. They became a legend, whispered about in hushed tones across the world. Their name turned into a symbol of what happens when a community collapses under the weight of poverty and neglect. Some saw them as victims, others saw them as curiosities. But everyone seemed to agree that the Whitakers were unlike anyone else in America. In odd West Virginia, their presence lingered like a ghost. The locals avoided the house not out of hatred, but out of unease. It was as if the place itself carried a heaviness, a reminder of something people preferred to forget. Outsiders traveled miles just to glimpse the home, to see for themselves the family whose faces had traveled across the internet. For those who visited, the reality was both more haunting and more human than they expected. Timmy wandering the yard, making sounds instead of words, Betty guarding her relatives with quiet defiance, Luis and Brandon existing in a world that seemed sealed off from time. These were not myths or curses, they were people. And yet the way the world looked at them stripped away their humanity, reducing them to symbols of strangeness, rather than acknowledging the suffering that created their condition. The Whitakers themselves never asked for this. They never sought fame or pity. Their lives unfolded in silence until someone from the outside decided to reveal them. And once revealed, they could never return to the shadows. Their home became a monument to survival in the face of isolation, but also a reminder of what happens when entire families are abandoned to fate. What makes their story so unsettling is not just their appearance or the tangled family tree, but what they represent. They are a mirror held up to society, showing what happens when compassion erodes, when communities turn away, when the poor and forgotten are left behind. The Whitakers became a legend, not because they wanted to, but because no one would let them remain ordinary human beings. The Whitaker family story is more than a tale of inbreeding isolation or poverty. It is a dark mirror that reflects the hidden truths of America. In their silence, we hear the echo of neglect. In their faces, we see the weight of choices made generations ago. And in their existence, we are forced to confront questions that most would rather avoid. They did not choose to become symbols. They did not ask to be filmed, photographed, or whispered about. Yet their lives have been transformed into a spectacle, a reminder that the world is always searching for shadows to stare at. The Whitakers have become the embodiment of what happens when humanity is denied connection, when isolation becomes a prison, and when survival is stripped down to its most fragile form. Their story is not only about them, it is about us. It is about the communities that looked away, the systems that failed, the silence that allowed their reality to continue for decades. The Whitakers live in a place where time feels broken, where history itself refuses to move forward, and though they remain flesh and blood, their lives have been frozen into myth. Mark Leiter's work gave them visibility. But visibility is not freedom. The internet gave them fame, but fame is not compassion. What the Whitakers needed most was not fascination or horror, but understanding. Yet that understanding is the one thing the world seems unwilling to give. So their house still stands in Odd, West Virginia. A house filled with memories and with lives bound by blood. A house that has become a symbol of what lies hidden in the corners of America's forgotten roads. The Whitakers endure not as monsters, but as survivors of a tragedy written in silence. Their legacy will not fade because their story forces us to ask a question we may never want answered. What does it say about us that we let them become this?